They silenced Sankara for daring to dream. They crushed Gaddafi when he spoke of African unity. So when Ibrahim Traoré stood before the world and blocked every Israeli deal in Burkina Faso, the whispers in foreign capitals were the same. This young soldier was signing his own downfall. But is it downfall or resurrection? For decades, Africa has lived with a cruel paradox, the continent richest in resources yet poorest in control. Foreign corporations arrived with promises of partnership telecom towers, mining contracts, agricultural aid. But behind the shiny brochures lay something darker, hidden surveillance, secret contracts, entire nations mapped, not for development, but for extraction. Now imagine being the man who sees all of it at once. 3 weeks ago, Traore received a dossier thicker than a Bible filled with evidence that every call, every message, every field of grain was being redirected to servers far from African soil. Alone in his office, as the desert wind rattled his windows, he asked the question no leader can avoid. Who do you serve? And here's the challenge for you. If your nation's dignity was on the line, would you risk everything to protect it or bow to those who write the rules of the game? 3 weeks before the decree shook the continent, a knock echoed on the heavy doors of the presidential office in Ouagadougou. It was past midnight. Most of the city slept, but Colonel Sawadogo, the head of intelligence, entered with a face carved in stone. In his hands, a folder so thick it seemed to bend under its own weight. He placed it on Traore's desk without a word. Inside were blueprints, maps, contracts, intercepted communications. Gold mines circled in red ink. Lithium fields dotted with coded symbols. Telecommunication networks that looked harmless on paper but were secretly rerouting signals through foreign servers. Agricultural projects fenced off from the very farmers they claimed to serve. Every page carried the same signature partnerships with Israeli-backed companies facilitated by French legal teams, British financiers, and American technology providers. This was not a collection of isolated deals. It was a spider web stretching across Burkina Faso, then into Mali, Guinea, Kenya, Ghana, and beyond. 17 nations bound by invisible threads, each leading away from Africa and into foreign capitals. Traore flipped through the maps. His hand stopped on one-page roads leading directly from Burkina Faso's mineral-rich zones, not toward local markets, but toward ports controlled abroad. He imagined the trucks heavy with gold and uranium, rolling silently through villages where children had no shoes, where mothers counted coins for bread. He saw his father's cracked hands in the mines, his mother's trembling fingers at the market, and understood that the chain was unbroken. According to government records, Burkina Faso is now the 4th largest producer of gold in Africa, and under Traore's leadership, the state had already begun reclaiming control over 8 tons refined in 2024, 11 more in the first quarter of 2025. Yet the dossier revealed that much of this wealth never touched African soil. It was map priced and exported through hidden agreements signed in boardrooms far from Ouagadougou. That night, the president did not sleep. The desert wind rattled his windows. The distant call to prayer rose before dawn, and still he sat staring at the evidence spread across his desk. Pages that should have been technical documents now felt like shackles, links in a chain disguised as cooperation. In the margins of one report, a simple annotation caught his eye. Operational integration complete. Data transmission stable. It referred to rural communication towers built with fanfare as symbols of progress. He remembered their unveiling children laughing under the steel structures, farmers hoping for better markets with faster connections. Now he saw the truth. Those towers doubled as surveillance hubs, recording not only phone calls, but also patterns of movement, population shifts, even political meetings. Traore leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down like a physical burden. He asked himself the same question that had haunted every African leader who dared to resist external control. Who do you serve? Your people or the powers who fund you? But in that moment, another realization cut deeper. This wasn't simply about Burkina Faso. The documents referenced operations in Mali, Guinea, Ghana, Kenya, each marked with identical red circles, each part of the same machine. If he acted, he would not only be defending his nation, he would be challenging a system designed by powers far stronger than his small, landlocked country. The clock struck 4 a.m. He closed the folder, his decision beginning to form like a blade in his mind. He knew that once he acted, there would be no return to the quiet lies of development partnerships. But how do you cut a web woven across an entire continent without tearing yourself apart in the process? At 5 o'clock in the morning, just before the first light broke over Ouagadougou, the secure line rang inside the presidential office. General Kabor, commander of the National Forces, was waiting. Traore lifted the receiver. His words were brief, steady, almost surgical. "Wake them up. Today, we cut the web." 2 hours later, as the city stirred from sleep, armored trucks rolled silently through deserted streets. Units fanned out across 17 pre-marked sites, telecommunication centers, warehouses, disguised as humanitarian depots, corporate offices with tinted glass facades. To ordinary citizens, these were just buildings of modern business. To the intelligence files, they were the arteries of a hidden empire. At the eastern edge of Ouagadougou, soldiers entered a pristine office tower decorated with corporate logos and smiling billboards. Inside, the air hummed with machines. Rows of servers stretched into the darkness, their lights blinking like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Engineers were taken by surprise, scrambling to explain. But the hard drives told the story better than any man. 2 million citizens' data, stored and ready for transmission abroad. Names, locations, private conversations, an entire nation's intimacy packaged for export. A second unit stormed a warehouse stamped with the words, "Emergency Relief Supplies." Soldiers expected stacks of medicine or sacks of grain. Instead, they found drones, hundreds of them. Not the commercial toys found in markets, but heavy military-grade platforms coded to track rural movements. Manuals written in Hebrew explained their targeting systems with maps of Burkina Faso's agricultural zones marked for surveillance. Meanwhile, another team uncovered financial documents hidden inside a so-called development consultancy. Ledgers showed payments routed through European banks, contracts signed under the banner of aid, but carrying clauses granting access to mineral-rich territories for decades. The same pattern, the same deception repeated again and again. By 9 o'clock, 6 sites had fallen. Reports streamed into the operations room, intercepted communications, confiscated equipment, shocked employees taken in for questioning. Each discovery mirrored the next, confirming what the dossier had revealed. What the world called partnership was in fact infiltration. What brochures advertised as progress was, in truth, surveillance wrapped in corporate branding. Yet amid the chaos, there were human moments that cut even deeper. A young soldier, barely 20, hesitated before smashing open a locked server cabinet. "Sir," he whispered to his captain, "what if this really is just business?" His captain looked at him, then at the blinking lights recording the heartbeat of a continent. "Business doesn't hide in the shadows, son," he replied. "Business doesn't need drones to watch farmers." With that, he swung his rifle butt and shattered the lock. The operation was relentless, synchronized like a surgeon's blade. No warnings, no negotiations, no delays. For years, the web had grown unseen, but in a single morning, strands were being cut faster than foreign operators could react. Still, Traore knew the evidence alone would never be enough. Documents could be buried, explanations, manufactured headlines rewritten. The world had ignored African truths for generations. If this operation was to mean anything, it had to be more than arrests and confiscations. It needed a voice, a declaration so loud it could not be silenced. At noon, the cameras would be waiting. The microphones would hiss with anticipation. Traore would have to stand before Africa and the world and explain why he had just dismantled decades of foreign influence in a matter of hours. And the question hanging in the air was, would the world listen, or would they brand him a tyrant before he could finish speaking? At noon, the doors of the presidential press hall opened, and the world saw a young soldier in uniform walk to the podium. The air buzzed with the static of microphones, the weight of cameras broadcasting far beyond Ouagadougou. Traore did not read from notes. He looked straight into the lens and spoke words that cut like steel. Africa is not for sale. Not our land, not our resources, and not our data. The room froze. For a brief second, even the hum of equipment seemed to stop. Outside, the streets erupted in cheers. University students painted his words on crumbling walls. Mothers held their children tighter, whispering, "Maybe this time will be different." By evening, the shockwave had reached beyond Burkina Faso. In Bamako, Mali, students gathered in Independence Square, chanting slogans of defiance. In Conakry, Guinea, fishermen's cooperatives announced they would no longer sell their catch to companies with hidden foreign ties. In Dakar, women's organizations demanded audits of every aid project, suspecting surveillance behind promises of development. None of these actions were coordinated, but instinct pulled them together. For the first time in years, Africans across borders heard an echo of their own voice. Traore's phone lines burned with calls from other leaders. Mali's interim president confessed they had discovered similar networks in Bamako, but hesitated to act. "What do we do?" he asked. Traore's answer was blunt. "Shut them down. All of them. Today." Guinea's generals revealed through encrypted channels that they too had monitored suspicious Israeli activities, but feared the diplomatic consequences. Traore's reply came sharp. Stop fearing diplomatic incidents. Start fearing digital colonialism. And then came the move that made international analysts nervous. Just weeks earlier, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had jointly announced their exit from ECOWAS, a decision compared by Reuters to West Africa's version of Brexit. Together, they represented 17% of the bloc's population, but only 7% of its GDP. Economists warned of collapse. Yet, on the streets, people felt something different: freedom from dictates of external bodies. The timing was no accident. With ECOWAS ties severed, the three nations could now align on their own security and digital sovereignty agenda without outside pressure. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso's national refinery had begun processing gold directly under state control, collecting more than 11 tons in the first quarter of 2025. Traore wove this fact into his public speeches. For the first time, the gold from our soil feeds our schools, not foreign vaults. To ordinary citizens, this was more than numbers. It was bread on the table, dignity in the home. The resonance across Africa was electric. In Ghana, graffiti artists scrawled, "Our data, our choice," across city walls. In Niger, farmers burned symbolic copies of contracts they said had enslaved them to foreign companies. Even in South Africa, marchers filled financial districts chanting, "Africa is not for sale." But beneath the euphoria lay an undercurrent of tension. Opposition figures in Burkina Faso, usually hostile to the military government, found themselves forced into rare agreement. One declared on live television, "Whatever our disagreements, no African leader can ignore the truth exposed today." The unity was unprecedented and dangerous. For if Africans began to rally across borders, the foreign powers accustomed to division would have reason to fear. Yet Traore knew that joy in the streets was only half the battle. Across the seas, phones were already ringing in Tel Aviv, Paris, London, and Washington. Lobbyists, diplomats, and intelligence officers would not remain silent. They would craft their own story, painting him as reckless authoritarian, a destabilizer of regional peace. The question was not whether Africa would rise; the crowds had already answered that. The question was how the world's most powerful capitals would strike back. Within hours of Traore's declaration, foreign capitals were buzzing with panic. Israeli envoys demanded clarifications, European newspapers printed headlines calling him a destabilizer, and American analysts filled television panels with warnings about radical leadership in West Africa. But the most dramatic moment came 2 days later, when a secure line connected Ouagadougou to Tel Aviv. On the other end was Benjamin Netanyahu himself, a man known for his iron composure. His tone was measured, almost patronizing. "Mr. President, there seems to be a serious misunderstanding about our activities in your region." Traore's reply was calm but sharp, the kind of reply that freezes a room. "The only misunderstanding, Mr. Netanyahu, was your belief that we would never notice systematic surveillance disguised as development aid." Netanyahu insisted Israeli companies were contributing to African progress, building infrastructure, creating jobs, modernizing agriculture. Traore cut him off mid-sentence. "When you build towers that record every private word of my people, that is not development. That is occupation with better marketing." For several seconds, silence stretched across the line. Later, leaked transcripts would reveal Netanyahu pounding his table in frustration, demanding to know how this young soldier had dismantled years of positioning in a single morning. Meanwhile, Western allies scrambled for cover. French media warned of economic consequences for Burkina Faso. British diplomats whispered of possible sanctions. American newspapers published op-eds questioning whether Traore was sliding into authoritarianism. Ironically, the same outlets rarely asked why foreign intelligence operations were treated as legitimate business in Africa. And yet, behind closed doors, the picture looked different. According to African diplomats, U.S. intelligence officials quietly admitted they were reassessing their data collection practices on the continent. Not out of goodwill, but because Burkina Faso's stand had sparked similar demands from Latin America and Southeast Asia. The domino effect was real, and Washington knew it. Back in Africa, the response was the opposite of the Western narrative. Crowds filled streets from Accra to Johannesburg chanting, "Africa is not for sale." Student groups held teach-ins about digital sovereignty. In Niger, farmers repainted village walls with slogans, "Our data, our choice." Most importantly, the African Union began private deliberations. For years, the AU had been criticized as slow, ceremonial, detached. But suddenly, member states were calling for a continental framework to safeguard data sovereignty. Just weeks later, the Pan-African Parliament issued a statement declaring that data is Africa's new resource and that foreign surveillance disguised as aid would no longer be tolerated. The symbolism mattered. For decades, African leaders had shuffled papers at AU meetings, reading prepared speeches, while foreign diplomats pulled the real strings. Now, one young leader's defiance was forcing an entire institution to consider a united stand. Still, for every cheer on the continent, there was a storm gathering overseas. Israeli media framed Traore as reckless playing with fire. European diplomats hinted at aid cuts. American think tanks produced reports warning of increased Russian influence in West Africa, casting suspicion on every move he made. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, a continent beginning to rediscover its voice. On the other, the world's most powerful intelligence networks unwilling to lose their quiet laboratory. And so the question grew sharper. Could Africa transform this spark into a lasting shield, or would foreign pressure suffocate it before it became a flame? For weeks after the decree, the streets of Ouagadougou remained restless but alive with energy. Graffiti in bold red letters declared "Our data, our choice." University classrooms became arenas of debate, young people dissecting contracts, demanding to know where their nation's information flowed. What had begun as a shock was now becoming a doctrine. In a dimly lit meeting room, 6 West African leaders gathered behind closed doors: Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, and later joined by observers from Ghana and Senegal. There were no foreign advisors in the room, no lobbyists with polished smiles. Just Africans speaking in their own tongues, mapping a vision for independence in the digital age. Out of those meetings emerged a document unlike anything Africa had seen before: the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. Its principles were deceptively simple: full transparency for all foreign investments in telecommunications and data infrastructure. No more hidden contracts, no national security loopholes. Zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence activity. Projects that could not prove civilian benefit would be terminated immediately. Mandatory data localization. African data stored on African soil under African law. Continental cooperation. Intelligence sharing between states to protect each other from infiltration. When the framework was announced, skeptics predicted collapse. They said Africa had no alternatives. They said isolation was inevitable. But within 3 weeks, the offers poured in. China, Russia, Brazil, and India all signaled willingness to work under Africa's transparency requirements. Even certain European firms, eager to distance themselves from their governments, began advertising themselves as digital sovereignty compliant. Burkina Faso, already strengthened by its nationalized gold revenues, over 11 tons refined in just the first quarter of 2025, suddenly found itself with new leverage. No longer begging for aid, it was negotiating on equal terms. And on the streets, people could feel the difference. Internet speeds improved after compromised servers were removed. Costs dropped once hidden surveillance expenses were eliminated. Farmers who once feared drones watching their fields now saw them replaced with cooperative-owned tools for irrigation. For the first time, digital progress did not come with invisible chains. The symbolism reached its peak at a student rally in Bamako. A young woman took the microphone and declared, "My parents lived under colonial borders. My generation lived under digital borders. But today, we are free to imagine something else." Her words spread across the continent, replayed in classrooms, quoted in newspapers, whispered in marketplaces. For foreign powers, this was more terrifying than any military maneuver. They could sanction governments' pressure leaders, rewrite headlines. But how do you silence an idea spreading in the minds of millions? That was the true victory of the framework, not just new rules, but a new expectation that Africa's future would be negotiated on African terms. Yet Traore knew the struggle was not over. Powerful nations were already plotting countermoves, whispering about sanctions isolation, even destabilization. He had won a battle, yes. But could Africa hold the line when the full weight of global powers turned against it? The battle for Africa's sovereignty has never been fought with one weapon. In the past, it was muskets and gunboats. Then it was banks and contracts. Today, it is fiber optic cables, satellites, and hidden servers. The methods change, but the intent remains the same: to make Africa a market, not a master. Ibrahim Traoré's stand in Ouagadougou was not just a national act. It was a message to an entire continent that dignity is not granted, it is defended. That sovereignty is not a slogan, it is a daily decision. He reminded Africa of something our ancestors already knew: freedom is not inherited. It must be renewed in every generation. But here is the truth many do not want to hear. The struggle has only begun. Foreign powers will not surrender quietly. They will try to fracture alliances, to paint leaders as reckless, to bribe, to threaten, to isolate. And yet the seed has been planted. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Johannesburg to Bamako, ordinary Africans are beginning to believe that their data, their resources, their future must serve them first. For the African diaspora watching from abroad, this is your call too. The same forces that stripped Africa's resources once profited from your ancestors' labor. The same arrogance that dismissed your dignity now threatens the continent's digital future. The question is not whether Africa can resist, but whether you will stand with it in spirit, in voice, in solidarity. So I ask you directly, do you believe Africa can defend its digital destiny without bowing to foreign masters? Or must sovereignty always come with sacrifice? If you believe, say it, write it, let the world hear it. Africa is not for sale. Type it in the comments, New Africa. Shout it in your heart, Africa forward. Proclaim it as a truth no power can erase. Africa can do it. Because history is watching, and the future belongs to those brave enough to defend it.